Welcome to the Sports Ethics Show. The Sports Ethics Show discusses the many ethical and philosophical issues that arise in and around sport. I am Sean Klein, the sports ethicist. You can read the Sports Ethicist blog at sportsethicist.com, where you can also download podcasts of previous shows, subscribe to the podcast, or find links to related information. The Sports Ethicist is also on Facebook and on Twitter at Sports Ethicist. You can email the show at sportsethicist@gmail.com. Today is March 5th, 2015. March Madness starts pretty soon, less than 2 weeks, I believe. Naturally, sports fans are starting to think about brackets and basketball. But with that comes discussions of the future of college basketball. With more and more players going to the NBA sooner, athlete compensation probably coming down the pike pretty soon, many fans are concerned about the college game. And the game has changed a lot. I think a lot of fans nowadays see the concept of student athlete as a bit of a joke or even just a throwback to bygone days. Now, one proposal that's attempting to put the student athlete genie back in the bottle is the idea of freshman ineligibility. Professor Chad Carlson joins the show today to tease out some of the various issues with this proposal, as well as some other NCAA issues. Chad Carlson is an assistant professor of kinesiology at Hope College in Michigan. He's also the junior varsity basketball coach for Hope College's men's basketball team. Welcome back to the show, Chad.
Thanks, Sean. Great to be here.
So our topic today is to talk about this idea of freshman ineligibility and how it might affect college basketball or what problem it's maybe trying to solve. So I was hoping you could tell us what freshman ineligibility is, what sort of the idea of this is, what the proposal is, what some of its history is.
There's been a considerable amount of momentum coming forward in terms of freshman ineligibility the last couple of weeks, and that's been due to a number of discussions that conference commissioners, school presidents have had, especially at the Division I level, regarding how to better prepare NCAA student athletes for the rigors of academia, how to better solve the issue of the racial divide among student athletes and how they're matriculating throughout their time on campus. The history of this issue is not all that complex, I would say, but it's relatively unknown. So I'll get into that first, then we can talk about the complexity of the issue today. Freshmen were originally ineligible in the early decades of the 20th century, and it was actually World War II that changed to allow freshmen to first be able to compete. The reason for that is obviously during World War II, many of our college-age men went off to war, leaving less and less players to be able to compete on the playing fields, the playing courts, on campuses that maintained their athletic programs during the early and mid-1940s. In the years after World War II was when we started to see freshmen becoming ineligible again as conferences and the NCAA decided to sort of re-implement this freshman ineligibility rule as we had more and more young men of college age and veterans coming back, and the GI Bill becoming a part of athletic programs on campuses. And so that probably isn't all that complex. What was complex then at the end of this freshman eligibility in 1972, it was 1968 that freshmen became re-eligible for sports outside of football and basketball. In 1972, that freshmen became eligible in both of those sports too. I think we have a couple of notable stories that occurred during that point in time. The late 60s and 1970s was the point in time in which John Wooden's UCLA Bruins ran their dynasty throughout college basketball. And some notable stories from that dynasty were that Lew Alcindor, who came in as a freshman in 1966 on UCLA's campus, was ineligible to play for the varsity. Yet Lew Alcindor, many general managers of NBA teams said at the time that they would draft him at that point in time. And they had said that since he was in high school, that they thought he was good enough to go to the pros right away. Mm-hmm. Anyway, Lew Alcindor goes across the country from New York City, where he grew up, to UCLA, has to sit out a year and actually plays on the JV team. Now, most schools had JV teams at that point in time. He played for the UCLA JV team, and the UCLA JV team beat the varsity team in an inter-squad scrimmage at the beginning of the season. The same thing happened a few years later with Bill Walton on campus. And I think at that point in time, athletic directors and the NCAA began to see, I think, how they could generate more interest in their national tournament by allowing some of these big-name freshmen to play on the varsity teams. So that's a little bit of the history. I think today, or at least the last couple of years, we haven't even thought twice about the issue of freshman ineligibility when you see, especially how well Kentucky has done the last couple of years with so many of the one and done players, a group of freshmen that come through for one season and then head off to the NBA. Why would we make freshmen ineligible? I think there's a lot of issues there at play, not the least of which is the education of the student athlete. But I think at the end of the day, too, a lot of the men, and it's mostly men who are raising this issue, the Big Ten commissioners, the school athletic directors, the NCAA administrators, are businessmen at the end of the day. They're CEOs of their companies, and companies want to make as much profit as they can. That's certainly an issue, and they need to balance that with treating employees well. These are 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23-year-old employees. And so that's a big part of it, too. It's the making money balanced with how can we best serve our employees.
Now, so it's going back into the history because that's pretty new to me. I'm very unfamiliar with the history of it. Um, so the World War II thing is interesting
Yeah,
that they took away the rule, made freshmen eligible. That makes a lot of sense. I'm
sure.
curious if there were debates about it or how familiar you are with this. Why was it brought back? Was it brought back just as a kind of return to normal? Was it brought back because there's maybe with the GI Bill and there's just more and more, just like an overflow of people going to college, and so this was a way to uh, 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 make more slots for upperclassmen to play, so to speak, or were there some other reasons, or was it just kind of a return back to normal?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. Um, and I think it becomes even more interesting when we understand that the other sort of major participation rule that changed during World War II was in football. Um, in football, we did not allow sort of a two platoon system where players had to go both ways until after World War II, and we come back with this flood of athletes, and then we start saying, well, we'll allow guys to play just one side of the ball.
Oh,
That was
really?
that was a major change that came about through that point in time too. But I think sort of the reemergence of this freshman ineligibility after World War II came about largely, I would say, because of some of the corruption that was occurring within the NCAA and some of its member institutions, and also some of the non-NCAA member institutions who participated against NCAA member institutions. And the issue has to do with um, different schools having different codes of conduct for their athletes and different codes of athletic conduct and academic conduct. And so we have, in New York City alone, as an example, we have schools that have very strong basketball programs, some of which have very low to say no academic standards, where anybody gets in. It doesn't matter as long as you can dribble a basketball or throw a football. And other schools, CCNY at the time, which had very high academic standards. And so there's a bit of a push at that point in time within the NCAA to sort of sanitize everything and make things a little bit more on an even playing field. And we see in the late 40s and early 50s the implementation of what's called the NCAA's Sanity Code, which was the first attempt for the NCAA to try to monitor and try to govern how athletic departments around the country um, allowed their student athletes to participate and what standards they held them to. So, along with all of that legislation, all that governance, I think comes this interest in sort of purifying college basketball or repurifying college basketball. And when we re-implement freshman ineligibility, what we're really doing is having sort of the blue, the upper crust or the blue bloods of college basketball saying, you know what, um, we think we do things right. We're good enough to be able to have our freshmen eligible and still win. Plus, we don't want teams like Claire B's LIU team, who everyone suspected of paying players and doing things that would go against the sanity code. Well, why don't we put these rules in place to try to get some equity here, and to try to level the playing field, and to try to say, well, we want everyone abiding by these rules because, after all, academics is first, and that's a big thing. But also, I think there was sort of a sense among these blue bloods that um, a little bit of a holier than thou righteous attitude, where what, we do want to stick with this amateurism idea or ideal, and this is one way we can do that.
Okay. Yeah, so it is still kind of tied into that amateurism idea,
Yeah,
and as you put it, a kind of blue-blooded way of sort of highfalutin way of looking at it, and it's that they had the talent and the programs in place already that they didn't they could forego the freshman talent where maybe a smaller school, less established school that was going to be an upstart school uh, wouldn't necessarily have that ability where if they could play their freshmen, maybe they could be more competitive. Is that,
Absolutely, absolutely.
yeah.
And we see this trickling into the early 1950s. One of the major events in college basketball's history was in 1951 when we had the gambling scandal, where 32 players from 8 different states were caught shaving points in games. And it was at that point in time that the NCAA was just sort of getting to the point where they needed that last push to sort of gain enough momentum to make freshman ineligibility widespread across the country. And this was sort of the last straw where we said, geez, we cannot have this happen, all this corruption. So why don't we pull back? Let's make ourselves a little bit more lily white here with this rule. Freshmen should be ineligible.
So it looks a little bit to kind of take the cynic attitude because it's not clear why making freshmen ineligible would be that much directly related to a gambling scandal, a point shaving scandal, some of the other corruption going on. So it looks a little bit like I don't want to say window dressing, but sort of like if we say freshmen are ineligible, it gives us the ability to say we care about the academics and to put that front and center. I mean, how much of this was driven more by, I guess, image as opposed to thinking that this would really make a measurable difference in some of the corruption in it itself. I know maybe as a part of a package of a whole set of rules, it might play that role, but on its own, it seems to me at least unclear how it would really connect in with some of the corruption that you're talking about.
I absolutely agree, and I think that's certainly a cynical attitude, but it has some truth to it. 1951, 1952 was also the point in time in which the NCAA hired its first executive director. That's Walter Byers, a guy who came up with the term student athlete because he was so image conscious about the
Hmm.
NCAA and the purity of college sport and the amateurism model, a student as an athlete. And I think that was a big part of it. All of this, where we're certainly not going to root out corruption and root out point shaving and gambling among players by making freshmen ineligible. There's not a direct correlation there. In fact, 10 years later, 1961, we see another major gambling scandal in college basketball. So that clearly didn't root it out. Um, there was some window dressing to it. I think that there was something that had to do with the image of of college sports, and I think that was a big thing too. Where in the 1950s was very much a hopeful decade for us, and I think we wanted to believe that we as Americans, after we had overcome World War II, we're now able to sort of navigate this divide. Where are our priorities, especially for our young people? Well, they should be with academics, and I think fans have always wanted to believe that, or fans of college athletes have always wanted to believe that they're the players that they watch and cheer for are real students. And this was one way of identifying it, saying, yeah, absolutely, they are. Further, it was a way of coaches to be able to um, develop players in the ways that they wanted. To take a kid onto campus and say, all right, this is sort of, it's really the original Redshirt. This is going to be your Redshirt year, without calling it that. But this is the year for you to develop. This is the year for the 6'9", 6'10" kid to work on being able to walk and chew gum at the same time. This is the year for the freshman point guard to learn how to lead. And I think a lot of coaches were for it because of those types of things.
Okay. All right. So uh, that's interesting history for sure. The history of the development of any sports institution and is always really fascinating just to see because we so often get caught up in the here and now and the way things are structured now and don't realize just how much all of our sports institutions, we're talking about the NCAA to the NFL to everything, have all, pretty much sprung out of nothing in the 1800s or a little bit later and have come to where they are through tremendous evolution and change and development. And so it's interesting to go back and look at that to see how different things were. But coming to the contemporary issue, so what do you think is really driving the push right now? I think you kind of touched on that, but well, it might have gotten lost in some of the history. So now we're up to the now, and I think is it the commissioner of the Pac-12 that's been one of the main vocal voices in pushing for this, I think.
Yeah, he
Uh,
has, and so has Jim Delaney of the Big Ten.
okay,
Really, the major pushback has come from Mike Slive of the SEC, their commissioner.
right.
The present day issue is I think very complex, and I think especially in this day and age when everybody has the ability to sound off on their thoughts,
Hmm.
it's going to be difficult to find a lot of consensus here.
I mean, any Joe Schmo can get a podcast.
That's absolutely right. Anybody can send out a tweet and it can get heard, and I think that's where we are right now. My guess is that a little bit of this has to do with um, sort of marketing promotion. I think that the old marketing mantra is any publicity is good publicity. And I think right now this is sort of the point in time, at which I think I think the NCAA is trying to build up some momentum to come into March Madness. And one of the ways of doing it is to bring up a discussion piece. And I think they've done that. Now that's a very cynical view too. There's certainly uh, uh, dollars and cents at play here. There's certainly the issue of student athlete well-being at play here, especially on the heels of the UNC scandal. And I think I just read somewhere that there's another 18 Division I schools that are right now being investigated regarding academic scandal by the NCAA.
Hmm.
So I think that there's really there's beginning to be a little bit more swell of momentum regarding the real rigors of academia for student athletes.
Okay. And so and so then the freshman ineligibility pops up again in some ways, just as in the way you laid out the history, as a kind of I'm looking for the metaphor here, but it's not window dressing isn't quite right, but as something that looks like it's addressing the issue, but really I'm not so sure does address some of the issues that we're talking about, because I think you're right. I mean there are there are some real issues. I mean, the NCAA has some real issues. I mean, the UNC scandal, all kinds of other scandals. The as I said in the intro, the idea of the student athlete as kind of being this sort of uh, seen as kind of a joke. At least when I mean, when you're talking about men's basketball and football, that the idea that and at the idea of student athlete and amateurism and all that seems to really have been viewed now as quite cynical, and so it's hard to see how freshman ineligibility again is really the solution, and how much of it is just this, for lack of a better metaphor, this window dressing for it. So maybe we could take a moment and try to take some of a non-cynical approach, and what are some of the positives? What are some of the pros of calling for freshman ineligibility, or not calling for it, but of actually implementing it? What are those who are arguing for it? What are their at least face on their prima facie claims for why they want to do it?
Well, the reality is that we have some mechanisms in place right now by which we make freshmen ineligible. And the simple redshirt idea that so many college football programs use for so many players is essentially
Can you quickly explain Redshirt?
the redshirt issue is when um, a Division I program will recruit a student athlete onto campus, and they will realize that student athlete either needs some work or they don't have room for them to get on the playing field, and so they will give them a red shirt, which means that the student athlete will be on campus, will practice with the team, but will not play in games, and therefore will not lose a year of eligibility.
Okay.
What the NCAA has put forth that will go into effect in 2016 is by name an academic redshirt year. So for student athletes who come to campus and find that they can't cut it or need time to adapt academically or come in with lower standards or lower abilities, they will be able to take an academic redshirt year. So that's the legislation that has been passed that will be in effect in 2016. And I think that that's sort of another part of the reason why we're talking about this right now, why it's on the table. I think another reason why we're talking about it, if we're going to be realistic with ourselves, is because of the NBA's discussion and some of the NBA Players Association's reluctance to elevate the age limit from 19 to 20 for American-born players. I think it's a part of it. I think a part of it has to do with uh, the ability of a team like Kentucky, Coach Calipari, to be able to recruit so many freshmen that are so talented every year and be able to have success doing it. I think there's probably some coaches around and some athletic directors that are saying, boy, we got a coach here, or a coach saying, boy, I'm a guy that really can coach the heck out of guys. But if I can't recruit, I can't compete. And so I think that there's a lot of push from the schools, and I would say from CBS and the other television networks to say, if we have freshman eligibility, what we're going to see is really better basketball. We're going to see better players sticking around longer, at least 2 years potentially, or even more. And as they have that time to work with their teammates under the same coach, we should be seeing some higher quality play, much like we did, in the 80s and early 90s before we had a lot of the guys coming out of high school straight to the NBA.
Yeah, so they would be able to, like the redshirt year, they'd be able to still practice and work with the team. It's not that they would just be on campus, but not participating at all in practices.
Uh-huh.
Right.
That's
Okay. Yeah. Because so I mean, sometimes when if you think of them as ineligible, they might be seen as that they're not even really participating. Although some of what in some of the research I was doing for this did look like some wanted to call for more restrictions on their time to prevent because part of the reason is because they're academically substandard or remedial or I don't know what the most PC way to say it, right? They're just not academically ready to be at college probably, and so they need some work and they need some time to focus on their academics. At least that's some of what the ideas for this is, and so they want to limit it even some of the time that the freshmen would even have to participate, but they'd still be able to participate to some degree. Is that correct?
Yeah, and that's with the current redshirt policy is that those who are redshirt still participate in everything except the game. So basically, they're not traveling to road games, which is a considerable ease on their time.
Hmm.
But I think we'd be naive to believe that when the team has traveled, that there's not a strength and conditioning coach that stays with them at home to make sure that they're putting in time
Right.
as the players are traveling. So there's that piece. But I think um, I've read the same things that with the new uh, freshman ineligibility proposals coming forward. Um, that we will see a considerable reduction in the amount of time. And right now it's 20 hours practice limit, which has some exemptions, and I think some people would believe that rule is a sham right now, anyways. Um, but I've heard that it might be pared down to 10 hours a week, so where we're not practicing 6 days a week, instead we're just practicing 4 or 5. We're not doing the extensive scouting for opponents if we were to implement JV programs again. Instead, we're spending time focusing on our own skill development in very non-threatening, non-pressure filled situations where a student athlete can take sort of a year to develop his or herself.
Now, how many of the top flight division programs have a JV team or something akin to that?
I'm not sure there are none that I'm aware of. In fact,
Okay.
even at the Division III level, it seems to be the trend that more and more schools are going away from it. And the reason for that is simple cost cutting measures.
Sure.
And also, when we have limited recruiting budgets and limited coaching staffs, it's much easier to focus on a smaller number of recruits as opposed to trying to recruit a ton of guys to come into the program and then say, all right, you can play a JV year and we'll see who makes varsity. Now,
Okay.
the schools that maintain this type of program, I think, believe that it helps them out. It does give kids that year to develop. You know, there's a reason why not why we miss on some recruits, why we identify them incorrectly. It's that people are still growing at that age.
Sure.
And so, without the ability to have an official redshirt season, having a JV team will allow a head varsity coach to oversee what's going on and to watch the development of freshmen.
So, do you think that if they did have this freshman ineligible year, this year of development, or year of readiness, I think they're calling it,
Yep.
do you think most of these programs would then develop some kind of JV or freshman team? that would.
I'm not sure that would come about at the top levels, at least right away. And I think that the issue would be if you run into the Lew Alcindor, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar situation again, you run the risk of people being more excited about your junior varsity program than your varsity program. And I think that has all kinds of negative implications for what a program wants to be about.
Mm-hmm.
On the flip side, especially in today's day and age, it's so difficult to keep anything under wraps or keep anything or anybody undercover. So if you bring a top-notch freshman onto campus, I think it's very difficult to not be able to showcase that person at all.
Mm-hmm.
So I imagine they would find ways to try to do that, whether it's through a JV program or I would suggest maybe just open practices or this or that, where people can come in and sort of watch and identify and see the talent, get excited about the future year and what's going to happen with all that. But these are some of the issues that make this a little bit of a Pandora's box here, where we're just not sure we want to get into that because what's going to happen of it.
Mm-hmm.
I think again we're naive to think that if we have freshman ineligibility, that the coaches are going to allow their freshmen to really have a ton more time towards their academics. I would
Right.
say, in fact, maybe the opposite, where coaches would just salivate over their ability to instruct this player without the player, having to go out and play 25, 30, 35 games in front of fans that will tell him or her what to do on their own. Instead, it's behind closed doors where the coach gets to navigate through every step that athlete is taking their freshman year.
Mm-hmm.
I think to coaches that can be very appealing.
Yeah, and it does ring a little. Again, my cynicism pops out a little bit. It does ring a little hollow when they start talking about an adjustment, a year of adjustment to college, a year of adjustment to academic life, to prepare for the rigors of academic life. Particularly when you're talking about uh, uh, men's basketball and college football at these elite levels. Uh, and I'd be surprised if they're going to be spending that much more time focusing on their academics, particularly for when if we bring in the one and done type situation, uh, where the players that are coming in and are the kind of player that could be one and done. Now they get okay, so they have this freshman year, so now they're two and done, or they're still kind of one and done. They have that 1 year of eligibility, and then they're gonna go off. Uh, how much of a value is that academic year preparation for them? It doesn't. Now, as an academic, I look at that and think, yes, no, academics, education, it's important, it's a value, but those are my values. Those aren't necessarily, the 18-year-old kid's value who has the potential to play in the NBA. His priorities are going to be a little different. Um, uh, but the whole idea, in some ways, of this year needing this year of focus on academics versus uh, instead of competition. I wonder, do you think that in some ways calls into question the very idea of college athletics, or at least grants or capitulates to the critics of college athletics, who say that look, the college athletics programs really are at odds with the academic mission of universities and colleges, or at least are inconsistent with it. And if we start saying, well, these kids need this whole year where they can't be competing because they have to adjust to academics, it seems like you might be capitulating a little bit to that argument, or maybe that's something we need to do. I don't know. So what do you think about that?
We are the only country in the world that ties up
Yeah.
sports and education so tightly. And I think that has gotten us to this unusual point here where we're sort of, I think, at a point in time we need to have these conversations, and yet we're a little bit uncomfortable talking about, stepping back and talking about this broader issue,
Mm,
sports and education being so closely tied. I absolutely agree with what you're saying. My slant is, well, of course we should encourage people to get college educations in any ways that we can, and if it requires, you know, I think admitting some students who maybe aren't prepared and then allowing them to get prepared through, student athlete services or whatnot. Excuse me. I'm okay with that. But at the same time, I wonder about the autonomy of the individuals that
mm-hmm.
are the strongest stakeholders here. And I wonder about sort of libertarian arguments. Why are we continuing to make it more and more difficult for a young man to get into the NBA when plenty of players have shown that they are capable of playing in the NBA at 18, 19 years old. Well, the last five number one draft picks in the NBA draft have been freshmen. And I
Yeah.
think players are showing that they're ready at an increasingly young age. I suppose there's some scariness there. And if we want to look at sort of the viability of the NBA's one and done rule, um, well, that's a little bit of a misnomer, but the NBA's age limit, I think we probably have a half dozen examples on one side to say that this is a bad rule because we're selling guys short, and on the other hand, we got a half dozen people that we can look to and say, wow, they have really succeeded. You know, the Kevin Garnett's, Kobe Bryant's, but more recently the Carmelo Anthony's and the Kevin Durant's and some guys that have really succeeded despite these rules, or maybe in spite of, or maybe with the help of these rules. And so it's difficult for me right now to sort of navigate where that is because I want to believe that we should give freedoms to people, especially people that are beyond 18, to sort of say, hey, this is my decision. This is what I want to do. And so that's where it is for me right now. And I wonder what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, I mean, the paternalistic concerns here do worry me quite a bit that we're sort of telling these top players who, by all accounts, and we're talking about, I mean, we're talking about a very small portion of students that go to college and play in athletics that are, capable of going into the NBA, going into the NFL, right? I mean, it's only you're talking about the cream of the cream, right?
Yeah, yeah,
But it does look like we're building all the rules around them, and then telling these top players who likely are really just coming in order to play so that they either to play just to play or to play so that they can get into the NBA. They're not really, again, by anecdotal accounts, they don't want to be students. That's not really why they're there. Now, I'm sure there are some exceptions to that, but we're telling them that in a sense that we know better and that they have to be students first for at least a year before they can play. And that strikes me as like you said, odd, right? In terms of when we look at the rest of the world, the way they handle their professional sports and their developmental teams, the academies that all the major professional teams have, it does seem like a lot more sane of a system.
yeah.
And our system, the accident of history here of these things growing up together. I mean, in a lot of ways, it's great traditions. It's exciting. It's different. I mean, we get excited about college sports in a way that I don't think the lower the developmental teams, the academy teams overseas for soccer and for basketball and so on. I don't know how much excitement and of course revenue that those programs generate as opposed to the way college basketball and college football, what the excitement and focus that they generate. But I'm not convinced either that if there was more of an arm's length between the university and the athletic program, at least the elite athletic programs, uh, that would go away. So I do wonder if there could be a way that we could structure, at least separate, pull out, the D1 basketball and football separated from everything else, and really have those two sports as kind of almost a separate entity that's still kind of in some kind of relationship with the university, so that's still the Duke Blue Devils, but they're not they're not necessarily students there, but maybe up, but still giving an option for those that want to be. So having some kind of dynamic relationship where those who are interested in being student athletes have that avenue and still can play in an elite program, and those that are really looking just to get into the NBA and whatnot, that they have that option as well. Uh, Now, maybe that's not stable. I don't know, but I'm I'm a fairly strong anti-paternalist, and so things that start to smell like paternalism, where we're telling these 18-year-old, 19-year-old kids how best to live their lives, I'm uncomfortable with that, and so I'm same with the NBA rule about not allow, you have to be 19. Uh, that 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 seems, again, also kind of paternalistic when plenty of players seems like if they're capable of doing it, well, why not let them? And if that's their choice and that's the path they want to take, that's that seems like they know better about what path they ought to be taking in life than I know about their path for sure. So I don't want to be in the position of telling them they can't do that yet. So
Right.
that's I think one of the stronger concerns that I have about such a rule like freshman ineligibility and a lot of the eligibility rules, whether um, I mean the academic ones, it seems like if you're going to have the relationship there with the university and there's going to be students, that you do need the academic regulations for eligibility. That does seem to me to be quite important. Um, but it also, I think, lends itself to a lot of corruption and a lot of what we've seen at UNC and which I'm sure is just the tip of the iceberg for a lot of places that have programs maybe not quite as explicit as what UNC was doing,
Yeah.
but I've been at big schools and Division One schools and know kind of you can kind of see the way things work,
Yeah.
and that even though someone who really can barely read and write somehow is able to pass all their classes, it's a curiosity at least.
Well, I think I absolutely agree. And at the age of 18, it's very difficult for me to stomach us being able to, or us forcing, 18-year-olds to do certain things or telling them they can or cannot do this. Now, obviously, we have that in other factors of, or in other sectors of society, right? And so we require that lawyers are licensed. We require that doctors are licensed, that teachers get their certification. We require them to jump through hoops. But I think this is a little bit different for us because what we're saying is, no, we see that you're capable of being at the big time, and yet we're not going to allow you to even attempt to be a part of that. And to me, that there's some difficulty there. And so when we talk, with freshman ineligibility or the one and done rule, we talk about having, a year of adjustment, and we talk about what we can or cannot tell or these student athletes. I think we're missing the boat. I think we're about 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years too late because there's so many college student athletes out there that truly believe that they're going to make it to the next level, that believe that they're going to be the next NBA or NFL player. And there are so many of them that don't get there.
All right.
It's a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. And I think that one of the ways in which we're misleading or that we're harming this generation of student athletes, is by not impressing upon them the value of education alongside athletics at an early age. So we're allowing them, they should have a year of adjustment in sixth grade and seventh grade, those years when they're playing these AAU tournaments going across the country and going to the meat market football camps. Those should be the years of adjustment.
Mm,
So by the time they've gotten to college, they are adjustment. They are
yeah.
adjusted. They do realize, I think, the value of all this and can be a little bit more long-sighted at that point in time.
Yeah, I mean, the problem does seem to be something that it's not like you said. It's not really just about college. It has its roots into youth sports and the elite youth sports, where we're identifying these athletes earlier and earlier and developing them and focusing on them much sooner. And it's not clear that that's even good for their long-term future in that particular sport per se, but it also just doesn't seem good for their just regular normal development. Um, but again, it kind of draws me back to the way the way the soccer academies seem to do things, where I don't know a lot of details about it, but they do seem to guys in their high school years, teenage years, are signing with those programs. I don't know how much education they're doing along with that, but in some ways it's sort of like a technical school, right?
Yeah,
They're learning their trade. Uh, now the system's different because they have all the different levels of professional soccer that you can play in without necessarily being at the top. Where American sports, we have obviously, I mean, baseball has the minor leagues, but that's the, the pay differential between playing in the minors and the majors is quite big, and that's really the only sport that has that extensive of a developmental program. Most of the other sports don't. unless you want to say that college is for basketball and football, and to an extent it is, but it's fairly indirect. So I wonder if some kind of system like that might be a little bit better, and that would also deal with some of the issues that you're talking about with the sixth grader, the seventh grader, because if they've already sort of signed with the Mavericks Developmental Academy, then they'd kind of be within that system, and that system would develop them. But that might even just exacerbate the problems too. I'm not sure that that's necessarily the solution, but it does seem like it is something that's rooted pretty deep, because there is this pot at the end of the rainbow, and so many people think that they have a shot at it, and the percentages aren't there. It's really you're basically winning the lottery, because even if you have the talent, which is hard enough, then you got to avoid injury and be able to get to a point where you can showcase the talent and then get drafted and still be able to maintain. So it's and then just the number of slots. I mean, there's only uh, you know I, I don't know, a couple thousand at best, right? I'm just
Yep.
rough math in my head. Slots, probably actually basketball a little less, because what do you have?
You have 64 players drafted every year. That's it.
Yeah, and each team they only have what, like nine guys on the squad. What's the basketball squad? Is it 12? Is it
An NBA squad would be, I believe, it's 12.
12? So yeah, so I mean, you really only have about 400 or 500 slots for professionals there total, and then you have 64 new ones coming in every year, and that's it. So whereas you have tens of thousands of kids playing basketball, thinking that they have a shot. Even and you're Hope's D3, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Um, I'm sure some of your student athletes have delusions that they might be able to maybe somehow break into the NBA. I don't know if they do or not. Some of the ways some of my students sometimes talk, I sometimes suspect that they think that.
Yeah.
I at ASU, I remember I was teaching a course. It was a freshman sort of academic introduction to academic life kind of course, and you do study skills and note taking, all just that kind of stuff, right? And I was teaching this as a grad student, and there was a student in there, and we were doing sort of career day, and you were supposed to, do something with what kind of career you're going to do. What are some of the plans you need to take? What if this is the career you want? What major should you be doing, and all that kind of stuff, right? And so this one kid was just like, I'm going to be in the NFL. And I remember I said, "Well, you're a freshman. You're a walk-on redshirt freshman at ASU, which isn't powerhouse football school. Uh, come on, you need a backup here at least. What are the chances? I went through all the statistics about how what the likelihood is of him making the NFL, and he really needs a backup. But he was stubborn. No, I'm making the NFL. I don't need a backup. I'm like, all right. So of course he made the NFL and played there for a couple years, but so I'm always amused by that story. But
He proved wrong.
yeah, I mean, I mean, he was a journeyman wide receiver. I mean, which is great. He still played in the NFL. He played on a couple different teams. He played for I didn't. Uh, I think at least 3 or 4 years he was in the NFL, and so making league minimum, that's a decent salary. It's not enough to live the rest of your life on. So I hope at some point he had some kind of backup plan develop for himself, that he's taking care of himself now. But yeah, I mean, some guys will make it. Those 64 guys do get drafted, but most of them don't. And even the ones that get drafted don't always make it more than a year or two. So it's if it's hard to say to somebody, well, you ought to have a backup plan here, because you're probably not going to live out your dream, because part of what makes the guys successful and live out their dreams are the ones that who refuse to accept that and continue to push at their dreams. So that stubbornness is part of what pushes them to be the great athletes that they do become. But it's also what can get some of them into trouble too.
Yeah.
So
I think this is another example of how maybe freshman eligibility might end up actually just being more window dressing than anything else. I think one of the issues that they're trying to address with this initiative is the the number of student athletes, which is way too high, that are not making professional leagues and that are not able to sustain high quality lives because either they didn't graduate because they went to the combine early or sold out their last semester to try to get to the league, or because they found they didn't go into a rigorous major, or because it was a school that didn't have a program that they liked and ended up being general education majors or something like that.
Hmm.
And so I think by making freshmen ineligible, it's still, maybe a bit of a red herring there, but we're not addressing the problem. We're sort of skating around the problem. The problem is that we don't have a whole lot in play in terms of the NCAA and its member institutions to help our student athletes who are at the end of the line or who have maybe just recently finished their eligibility or whatever, and realize they don't have anything.
Right.
So if we're looking at freshman ineligibility, we could say, okay, that's a year to adjust and a year to sort of maybe take a look at what academic offerings you're interested in. Okay, that's one thing. But I'm going to tell you what, I think you'll understand as well as anybody that a freshman on campus, that even a freshman who's not a standout football or basketball player, that's not the only thing they're thinking about. And certainly that
Right.
would be the highest priority on their minds. And so I think that we might be looking at this inaccurately here again also. What we should be doing is on the back end placing programs in place for our former student athletes to be able to find what it is, that they can do to sustain a good quality living once they finally, probably too late, have realized they're not making the league.
Now, what do you think about some of the proposals that have come out about uh, sort of crafting majors in the sport? So, if you're playing football, you sort of major in football or something related to that. Uh, and there was something in the New York Times magazine, I think, a couple weeks ago about that. And it's an idea that's been floated, a kind of where you'd study. It would kind of be a career preparation both for if you're going to be a professional football player or basketball player, but then there would also be other elements in there in terms about coaching and as well as maybe the business side of sports, help prepare them for their financial situations and managing that, and then managing the post career. Because even if you're a successful athlete, you still have a life after your athletic career ends, which you're still fairly young, and you still have life to live. And so even if you're set financially, and so you don't need to worry about that end. There's still stuff to do. You're not just going to sit around when in your mid 30s. I mean, when you're 18, you think, well, if I have all that money, I'll just sit around and play PlayStation all day or whatever. But by the time you reach your mid 30s, you have family, you realize, no, I want to do something more with my life. And so, maybe giving them some tools early on to start preparing for that post athletic life. And so just kind of crafting uh, their major. So not forcing them to say, okay, go be a communications major or uh, that seems to always be the most common one, a communications major or just a history major or something like that, unless they want to be. I'm not saying you force students to do this, but that for the students who are primarily there because they want to be professional athletes, that actually creating a major that prepares them for that kind of career path, and because they may not be the athlete, but they may end up within coaching or scouting or other ways in the system. So I don't know if you're familiar with any of those proposals
Yep.
or what you think about that.
I love this type of initiative in theory. I love it in theory. And I say that because I think it's fair. I think it fits with a lot of what our schools are doing. We offer uh, the ability for a student athlete, I'm sorry, for a student to major um, in high brass instruments. We allow them to major in vocal presentation in music. We allow them to major in sculpture,
Right.
in watercolor painting. All these specialized options in the fine arts and the performing arts that fits in terms of the types of intelligence being tested and being utilized and being developed as what we have in athletics. And so to me, I think we've sold a lot of college students short over the years by not offering this type of program. I would have jumped at it. I've been the first in line, but I can think of, all kinds of friends and colleagues and former classmates that I had that would have done the exact same thing.
Hmm.
And I think we're probably selling our sports short a little bit by not offering majors that would include coaching. Coaching is probably one of the we still coach and we still learn coaching through the apprentice model. We don't educate ourselves in other departments that way nearly as much. We don't have a whole lot of coaching education. And so to incorporate some of that into what we're doing with some of those majors, I think would be outstanding. But that's all still in theory. I think
Right.
practice is where the difficulty comes. And when I brought this up to one of my classes last year, sport ethics class, and the first thing that a student said back to me was, can you imagine if they offered a football major at the University of Alabama? Let me tell you what's going to happen there. And I totally on board with what the student said. First of all, Nick Saban is going to not force, but sort of not nudge, nudge, wink, wink, say you're going to major in football, and that's it. So you're going to sort of probably find some programs where you're really limiting students' options
Right.
because you're offering this, this option. So I think that's a major issue. I also think that part of the value of college, and of course this goes along with the fact that I work at a liberal arts institution, part of the value of college is learning things in areas where you didn't originally have interest. And I would hate to have us bring in a student who only knew football or only knew basketball and allow them to be fully in a basketball football major. I think then we're also selling that student short by
Yeah.
not forcing him or her to be a part of business classes or history classes or philosophy or
Well, you
what.
could still have the general education
Sure.
requirements that they have to meet, and in the same way that the vocal student still has to take philosophy or something similar, humanities has to go through the math sequence, the writing sequence, rhetoric sequence, right? And so they would still have to go through that. One of the other concerns, like yeah, going along with the Nick Saban, well, you're going to major in football, and so the sort of coursive element there of limiting the students' options, which I think is a real concern, is the other corruption that it might invite too. I mean, you have the just the analogy to what was going on at UNC, like how real would these courses be? I mean, some of my academic friends, when I talk to them about it, I mean, they view that as just a kind of capitulation to the system, and just well, they're not going to be taking really any classes at all. Their classes are just going to be preparation for the games, and not really focusing on the kinds of things that we're talking about in terms of coaching and life preparation and sports management, and incorporating all those elements and kinesiology so that they better understand their bodies and how their bodies work to help prevent injury, all this stuff that if you designed it right and actually had I think it would be great, but it seems like it would probably end up being quite empty at a lot of the institutions that are the institutions that have these problems to begin with, right? I mean, we're not, Hope or Rockford, we don't necessarily have these kinds of problems with our student athletes because their chances of going pro and that kind of pressure are pretty small to begin with. They're not on athletic scholarships anyway, so it's a very different situation. Um, and so, yeah, it would be the sort of Auburns and Alabamas of the world that would end up taking these sort of programs and stripping them down to their basics anyway. And so it wouldn't really solve the problem either.
Right, exactly. So this is where we differ from the fine arts, the performing arts programs. So be that their, their coursework is geared towards their learning and development in that area, so that they can present better over time. And it's not a competitive presentation.
Hmm.
When we have the competition where it's us against another school, that's where we could see some of that focus of the overall coursework just being sort of narrowly confined to how do we beat Auburn, as opposed to how do I teach you about football? How do you better understand the game to be an educated coach or spectator or whatnot?
Now, how much do you think is something like this freshman ineligibility rule or similar kinds of rules and restrictions? How much how much do you think the athletes want things like this?
I
Uh,
would say, yeah. Well, I think that's one of the issues here. As I was reading through some of the current news articles about this topic, not once do we hear the voice of a student athlete saying whether they would want that or not. A current student athlete. We have guys like Barry Alvarez right now, the Wisconsin athletic director, saying, "Yeah, we'll be discussing it. It was good for me." But of course, he can say that with hindsight. 40 years from when he was ineligible as a freshman.
which
I
was a
think it's
different world, I mean,
exactly.
the 70s, the 60s, it was a different world for colleges in general, let alone just college athletics and athletics in general.
It's a different world, and our sports are different at this point in time. I think, I certainly couldn't speak for all student athletes. I gotta believe that right now there would be a lot of pushback from student athletes who realistically don't have a unified voice at this point in time. This is part of the whole union stuff that's
Hmm.
going on. But I got to believe also that 30 years down the line, they're looking back, and aside from the Nerlens Noels of the world who get injured in that 1 year where they're forced to play college basketball, or the 3 years they're forced to play college football, and it's almost career ending, I got to believe that a lot of them would look back and say, you know what, I think that was a good year. And unfortunately, the stakeholders are the student athletes right now,
Hmm.
and the ones who have the ability to make a lot of money very quickly.
How much do you think the NCAA is part of the problem, uh, in the sense of well, in a number of different ways? I mean, do you see them as really the way that some of these issues are going to be solved is going to come through the NCAA, or do you think it's going to come from other avenues?
Well, these problems are, I would say, uh, endemic, and I would say that they're also sort of demonstrating some greater ills within society. The NCAA has certainly become a very powerful organization. I have a hard time believing that Mark Emmert is sitting in his office, tapping his fingers together with a grin, trying to figure out how to do things wrong. I really don't think that's the case. I believe that the NCAA has the best interests of the institutions at heart. The problem is with the Power Five conferences. And I think them wanting to do things so differently from the rest of the NCAA constituency, which is the majority of the schools that are NCAA members.
Hmm.
And so it's difficult for the NCAA because they are simply the voice of the schools. And so they sort of they need to act on behalf of what they think is best for their member colleges and the students that are students at those universities and colleges. And so I think the NCAA is in a very difficult position. It might even be untenable in the long term. But for right now, I think they're trying to navigate how to appease the Power Five conferences, who are all pushing for sort of more professionalization, less restrictions, unless it does good for them to make money because it's a business there, and also then uh, advocating on behalf of the other 1,100 schools that are
Hmm.
NCAA members.
Well, that was also part of my thinking in the background of asking that question, not so much as a way of blaming the NCAA, but that as such a large institution and a powerful one, but kind of entrenched as well, but then also representing such diverse set of interests, I
Right.
wonder if and and then also us not really knowing how a lot of this stuff would play out, that it strikes me as having a lot more openness and allowing for more experimentation might allow us to find some different models. And so one of the things that I guess would like to see is actually the NCAA pull back a little bit, have the 5 or 6 big conferences, let them do a little bit of their own thing to see what kinds of things that they can discover and find out about how they can maybe try to strike this balance a little better. And so really kind of almost separating out, the top men's basketball and football programs and recognizing that they're really a different animal altogether than the rest of college athletics, and let them experiment with finding a model that better fits what they're trying to do, both the financial concerns and pressures and interest, but then also the academic and interest as well. That's still kind of part of it. Well as the other institutions and the other sports, where the student athlete idea isn't a joke, is a reality. And I know I mean, again, anecdotally, the students I have and have had over the years, the student athletes in the non-basketball, non-football student athletes are often my best students. And so I don't think there's a problem with student athletes in general, but the basketball and the football students, even at D3 school, are often fit the public stereotype of those students. And so even that, and I don't know if you have that same experience at Hope, but I've had that here at Rockford. I've had that as well at when I taught at other institutions. And so there's a difference there. And I think if we're by putting them all under one governing institution and one umbrella, I think it's becoming too top down. Where I'd like to see more diversity of 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 systems and diversity of uh, uh, what's the word I'm looking for? I don't know, programs that can develop to see how the SEC might try to do things versus the Pac-12, versus the Big Ten, and and have them experiment with some different things and have them see what might work or not. I mean, and so because even we haven't even touched on the compensating of athletes, which I do think is coming to some degree down the pike, probably sooner rather than later. Um, it, I don't know how they're going to do that.
Yeah,
And I think if it's it, and it, I think all the institutions are quite different. I mean, what Auburn or what Alabama can do is going to be quite different than what UNH can do,
right.
or an ASU, or some school in North Dakota. I mean, their needs, their interests, the students are going to be different. And so and the different conferences I think are going to have different needs and interests too. So I think giving them the freedom to experiment with how the different models, that's the word I was looking for before, models, the different models to see how they can try to strike the balance a little better to satisfy all the different stakeholders in place, including the student athletes, which I think are the ones that often do get left out of the conversation the most.
Well, I agree. I think that needs to be readdressed. And historically, the NCAA has done that over time. And, the original NCAA basketball tournaments up until 1952, it was all one. Everybody that wanted to participate uh, was in this one tournament. Of course, it was only the big schools that ended up getting chosen to play of the 8 participants. In 52, we go to a university division and a college division. And then we do that for about 20 years. And in the early 1970s is when we start getting into the Division One, Two, and Three model of athletics, which changed then again to add at the Division One level, Division One A, One AA, One AAA, even at that point in time. I think there's been discussions in the past about adding a Division Four, and I think you're exactly right. We have a number of different stakeholders within the NCAA's membership that all have different goals, aims, and resources to try to meet those things. And when we stick with the level structure like we have, what ends up happening is just an arms race. And so right now, if you're going to say ASU might do something different than Alabama or Auburn, that might be the case. But right now, they're in the same division, and you know what? They need to keep up to be
Right.
able to meet the bottom line.
Yeah, and so if you had a division of schools that wanted to have higher academic standards, right now that's tougher to do because they have to compete with schools that are less interested in that. So I think if you had a grouping of colleges that wanted that and could compete with each other, they might, and not be in the same division, they might be able to do something like that, and experiment with that. And maybe it works out, maybe it doesn't. I don't know.
Well, we've
That's
sort of we've sort of tried to fit the Ivy League and the Patriot League into this Division One model, and they clearly have different aims, and I think it's been difficult for them to have competitive success because of that.
right. I mean, yeah, you do have a school like Stanford that's able to have success, but they seem somewhat of the exception.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
well, that's about an hour, and I think we've only scratched the surface of this issue. I mean, the issues with college sports, youth sports in general, is a massive one. So I hope at some point we can get together again and revisit some of these other issues. How does that sound?
I would love that.
Great. But that's all the time we have for today. Though, if you have any, I'll give you the opportunity to say any last words or closing comment on the issue of freshman ineligibility or anything else we touched on.
This is all very interesting stuff, and I think we need to sit down and be having these critical discussions about what's best for sport. We can listen to anybody, any number of talking heads in the media, online, read things, but really what needs to happen is to have some real serious discussion, scholarly discussion, educated discussion regarding, I think, what's best for all the stakeholders involved.
This has been the Sports Ethics Show. You can find us at sportsethicist.com, Facebook, and Twitter. You can email the show at sportsethicist@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for listening.